Hi, guys. Today I have my friend Bryce with me today. I found Bryce. He has his own website. It's really great. I had some spiritual questions. I can't even remember what they were at the time, but I just kind of searched on Google and see what popped up. And his website popped up, and I looked at it, and I was like, man, this is an awesome website. This guy has done his homework. He's really been thinking about these things I've been interested in. And also, I saw that you could contact him and have video chats with him. So I did that and found him great. And so, Bryce, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about who you are?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Bryce Haymond. I grew up in Utah, pretty close to Salt Lake City, little town called Sandy. This is kind of where I grew up. I was born into a Mormon family and grew up Mormon for my whole childhood. That was my upbringing. As many people in Utah are Mormon, LDS, as it's also called. And so I had a pretty normal childhood, I think. I have three brothers and my two parents, and we did some pretty average things, as a family growing up. Went on, family vacations, and I went to school and did, your pretty typical things growing up. I was very involved in the church, as Mormonism is a very very demanding religion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you go to church every Sunday, but then there's also like weekly activities as well that you're involved with. So I was doing all of that, and I was also in Scouts, which at the time was quite a part of the church, kind of integrated into the church. And so I was doing Scouts and scouting trips. And
what is Scouts? Sorry.
Say again.
What is Scouts exactly?
So Scouts, it's like the Boy Scouts, where you can get different rankings, all the way up to your Eagle Scout award, which is kind of considered one of the top rankings in the scouting program. But it's basically like it's a program for boys, and there's also Girl Scouts.
Right.
But for us, it was just a way to get to know the world and kind of get outdoors and do outdoor activities, go on scouting trips and camping trips with your troop, and learn things like how to tie knots and how to rough it outdoors and stuff like that, and do merit badges on different topics and things like that. So I was really involved with that. I was also got involved in ballroom dance, interestingly, and did a lot of ballroom dance during my teenage years. I was on some ballroom dance teams. And when I got to college, I went to BYU in Provo, Utah, and was on the ballroom dance team there, which was actually a touring group. And so we got to, every summer, we got to tour internationally in different countries all around the world. And so I've been to many different places, which I went with the ballroom team. What else? I went on a mission for the LDS Church. I was a missionary. When I was 19, 20 years old, I went to El Salvador on my mission. And so I learned Spanish and was there for 2 years. And for about half of my time there, I worked in the mission office as the financial secretary for the mission, which was an interesting experience, kind of seeing, high level workings of how the mission operated. what else? Met my wife at BYU, and we got married in the Salt Lake Temple, which is where a lot of Mormons like to get married because it's kind of the premier, place.
It's the Mecca.
It's the Mecca, yeah,
the
exactly.
Holy Land.
Exactly. It's like the original, the oldest Mormon temple, or at least one of the oldest. There are a couple others that are older, but they have different stories. And so then, me and my wife, we started a family. We have 4 children. I graduated from BYU and started working professionally as an industrial designer, got my degree in industrial design. And so started to work in that field, designing, developing, manufacturing technology, accessory type products. Worked for several different companies doing that kind of work, and visited China several times to work with factories there to design and manufacture products. So that was interesting. And kind of during all of this, I was kind of exploring my faith a little bit more, and I got really interested in the LDS Temple early on. Back basically on my mission, which was kind of years 2000 to 2002. I got really interested in kind of the temple and what we did in the temple. And in Mormonism, the temple is kind of the most esoteric type of religious rituals and ceremonies, and kind of what we call ordinances, where it's kind of like you could say baptism is a kind of ordinance. And so we do those kinds of rituals in the LDS Temple. And I got really interested in these this kind of more esoteric religion. And so I started studying, the history of the LDS Temple, but also, beyond Mormonism into other religions and their sacred rituals and ceremonies and kind of initiation rites and things like this. And so I began writing about the LDS Temple. I started a website. It's actually still online. You can go and read what I was writing about the temple at templestudy.com. And was getting really interested in kind of the more scholarly investigation and research into esoteric religion. And that kind of led me towards mysticism, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot here. I didn't know what that was kind of at the time. We don't really talk a lot about mysticism in the LDS Church. It's not a common word, but that is kind of the direction that I was heading when I started learning more about these kind of initiation rites and ceremonies and the kind of the more mysterious parts of religion and my own faith.
Do you think that I'm just hearing, you traveled so much for your job and for your mission, all that. Do you think that those travels and seeing different cultures and different people, different religions, do you think that kind of spurred you on, led you to kind of investigate these things and think about religion and faith more broadly?
I think so. Yeah, I think the more you are exposed to different cultures and different people, different ways of life, different understandings, different worldviews, the more you consider your own worldview and your own culture and your own religion, and you start comparing and contrasting and start wondering, about your own particular point of view, your own belief system. And I certainly started doing some of that, started doing, a lot of comparing and contrasting. At the time, back when I was an active member of the LDS Church, I believed, as many Mormons do, which is that the church is the correct church, the true church, the right, the one and only true church of God, on the earth, as probably many Christians believe that about kind of Christianity in general.
You say the church, you mean like the Mormon church?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It's a common belief among Mormons that the LDS church is kind of the one and only true church of God. And that's certainly what I was brought up to believe, But as you're exposed, to these other cultures and these other religions and other ways of belief, you start to question that a little bit. You start to look at yourself in the mirror a little bit more closely and wonder, is that true? Is that real? Like, is the way that I believe the only real, true way of looking at God? And so I started questioning, those things, and it started leading me into kind of a bit of a faith journey. I had, I guess, what you could call a faith crisis, where I started not believing some of the things that I had been taught to believe, right? I started doubting what I had been taught as a child, and started, looking a little bit more broadly in terms of what might be true about God, about spirituality, and so this eventually it led me to leave the LDS Church in about 2015, 16 or so. I stepped away from the LDS Church. I felt like I couldn't believe what it was teaching me anymore. That I had to expand my horizons a little bit more and do some searching, some soul searching. Me and my wife, actually. And that was pretty hard. That was a really difficult thing to do, because I was, born into Mormonism. It was my whole worldview, was kind of framed around the church and Mormonism and Christianity, and so to leave that was just really crushing. It was just it made me depressed for a time, trying to just work through my mind, what is true, what is real, what is my life about, and so I went on, kind of a faith journey, trying to explore these questions and try to find some answers. And that led me to discover some spiritual practices, specifically meditation, which I thought that's really interesting. I hadn't really considered meditation as a genuine spiritual practice before then. It had always sounded kind of weird and out there, and kind of, what the other religions do, right? But I kind of stumbled upon it and started reading about it, and kind of developed my own meditation practice, which I started to do kind of on a daily basis, trying to find something that some sort of insight, or something that I could hold on to, some sort of new belief that I could have regarding God and my own self and all of this. And after doing this meditation practice for several months, I did start having some insights and interesting experiences, which we'll probably go into a little bit more, I discovered that these are typically called mystical experiences in spiritual practices like this, where there's kind of a veil that's lifted, and you can see a deeper reality. It's called insight in many traditions, or revelation might be what they would have called it in Mormonism. But it's very eye-opening, these kinds of experiences. You begin to experience God within yourself, and that is a really remarkable thing.
Right.
Especially when you come from a religious tradition where you do a lot of thinking about God, right? You read all the scriptures. You're doing lots of talking about God. You're thinking through all the doctrines and the stories, and it's very intellectual, all up here kind of in the mind, but there's not a lot of embodied experience of God. We talked a little bit about that in when I was in the church. We called them spiritual experiences, and they were considered kind of rare, and it was more like just a kind of a burning in the bosom, like a really good feeling inside, and that's what they called having a spiritual experience. But when I was doing my meditation practice and having these insights and these mystical experiences, they were much, much more than just what I had experienced before in the LDS church. So that's kind of, I guess, a background of where I've came from, and kind of how I got into and interested in mysticism, and kind of where my practice started of meditation, and where I began to start having some experiences, which kind of really opened up my eyes to, the spirituality and what it is fundamentally. I think I had some good insights into that, and so now I have started another website, thymindoman.com, where I have started writing a lot of these insights and these ideas, and that's where Kendall stumbled upon that site and read some of what I've written there.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thanks for sharing your journey. And yeah, I share a lot of the same things I talked about on this podcast before, and I shared with you. I kind of had my own mystical experience with God, and I also kind of went through. Mine was kind of reversed, maybe a little bit, in that I experienced that, and then I started being like, well, what is real? What is faith? And all that stuff. And, someone called that the dark night of the soul. I think St. John of the Cross kind of coined that term, because it is really hard once your perceptions and boxes of the world are shattered. Then you're like, well, what is true? What is real? And the bedrock of what you grew up with is just kind of broken. So you kind of have to like figure out what is the foundation. And so your website, Thy Mind, Oh Man, I really love, because you explored so many different peoples from so many different faith traditions, or even non-faith traditions, or just individuals, poets that have had these experiences, and that really got me thinking, like, kind of when I had my experience talking to some charismatic Christians, they call that the baptism of the Holy Spirit, which is like in addition to water baptism and like the disciples at Pentecost. But, it seems like lots of people besides Christians were having these types of experiences. So that made me think, if this isn't just Christians who go to heaven, maybe there is something like, universalism or something like that. So I guess,
that's definitely one of the interesting things about mystical experiences, is that they're not just exclusive to any particular religion.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody and everybody, all around the world and throughout history, there have been many people that have had these kinds of experiences, these eye-opening, experiences of something much greater than their self, whether they call that God or the divine or, the Tao or the Buddha or the, whatever it might be, whatever word they attach to it.
Mm-hmm.
These experiences, people have been having them, throughout history and all around the world and in different cultures and different religions.
Right. Yeah. I think it might be helpful to the audience to just give some names for what people call this and who's had it. So for me, what comes to mind, I think Hindus or Buddhists call it Kundalini awakening. There's lots of people in non-dualism. They call it oneness or non-duality. And then I know some psychologists have gone into it. William James calls it. He has a book, Varieties of Religious Experiences, and then even Jung got into it. He called it psychic change. What are some that you've discovered?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different names for these kinds of experiences. Awakening, conversion type experiences, like Paul on the road to Damascus, when he saw a great light. Those kinds of conversion experiences that could fit into that. There's peak experiences. Sometimes they're called that, or flights of the soul, or even if you get into near-death experiences, I think can fit in there, as well as even kind of really outlandish alien encounters or UFO encounters. I think also fit into that category of mystical experiences. They're obviously framed in a very different way, right? They're not necessarily religious or spiritual. But I think they might be another manifestation of mystical experiences.
Right. So what do you think is at the core of these experiences? Like, what is the realization? What is Yeah,
that's a good question. There's many different ways to approach these experiences, but in my view, I think what's happening is that we are changing our consciousness. We're entering a different state of consciousness. Sometimes they're called altered states of consciousness. And so the way that our mind is functioning, the way that we're thinking changes. Like the way that we're processing information changes, and sometimes radically so. So, we could call kind of our ordinary, everyday experience of life kind of the normal waking state, where we're perceiving things in our environment through our senses, and we're processing those things, and we're having thoughts, and we're processing those thoughts, and we're organizing information. So that's kind of the ordinary everyday state of consciousness. But what's interesting, and William James talks about this a lot, that there are other states of consciousness, and we shouldn't just reject them as abnormal or strange or pathological. They might also be interesting and insightful states of consciousness that can be insightful and tell us more about ourselves and this reality that we're living in. And so in the mystical experience, it's a shift in our state of consciousness, and kind of the best way that I like to describe it is the thinking mind kind of shuts down. All those thoughts that keep rolling around in the head. In a lot of spiritual practices, there's a focus to kind of let go of those thoughts that are kind of rolling around in the mind. Just kind of witness them, acknowledge them, and then let them go. And as you do that again and again and again, usually takes a lot of time, but eventually those thoughts, they kind of slow down. Eventually the thoughts stop coming up. They basically stop. And that's when it gets really interesting, because most people are not familiar with that kind of empty mind. We're usually so caught up in our thoughts and our perceptions of the world. Most people are not familiar with kind of that empty, silent state of mind. But it is a very interesting state. And that, I think it's in that kind of silence and in that kind of empty mind that we begin to have some real deep insights into our nature and our spirit and even in the nature of reality itself. It can kind of sound crazy that you would have those kinds of insights when there are no thoughts happening. But a lot of, like I said, a lot of contemplative spiritual practices, they kind of have as a goal the quieting of the mind. And when the mind reaches kind of a state of silence or peace or stillness, that is what a lot of traditions, especially in Christianity, they call contemplation. And it's in that contemplation that insight arises, not necessarily as a thought, but more as a state of being almost. One begins to see the nature of consciousness itself, and begins to identify with that, and not all of the stories that go on when there are thoughts in the mind. There's the story of, this is my life, this is my body, these are my beliefs. There's also, the story of the ego, who we think we are, right? It's a series of thoughts that rolls through our mind that tells us who this self is, this ego. And so when those thoughts kind of subside and they stop, well, then who am I, right? It begins to be very interesting and insightful to experience that state of consciousness, because those stories are not there. Those identities are not there. Those attachments, all those thoughts that we think make up, who we are and what reality is all about. They're just not there. And so that then I think reveals a deeper layer of our being. We might call it, our spiritual being, or, consciousness, or, I think, some people even refer to it as God, as the divine, that deepest nature that we can find within ourselves, within consciousness. It takes on the qualities of God, and it's really hard to talk about.
You're doing a great job.
And mystical experiences are kind of known for this. They're kind of ineffable, unspeakable, indescribable, because they transcend all those ideas and concepts and words. And so trying to put them into words is kind of this, it's a process of interpretation and translation, trying to fit experience into ideas and symbols, and it can be very difficult to try to describe these experiences.
Right. Yeah. I think that, having these experiences help us realize that, you know, words and concepts, theology, religion, all this stuff is just their ideas or concepts trying to describe these experiences, and so it helps us be less dogmatic, saying it has to be this way or this way. It's like, no, the experience is beyond all that. It's pointing to even greater truth, and all our words are just symbols of that, and so we don't have to hold too tightly to the words themselves.
Yeah. One of the insights that a lot of people have is that that there is truth in all the different religious traditions or spiritual traditions, that they're all kind of ways of interpreting or translating that deepest mystical experience of God. And they all have different ways of doing that, in their own language and culture and time and understanding. And there's many different ways of describing those experiences. And a lot of times those ways can even seem contradictory and conflict with one another. And I think that is pointing to the paradoxical nature of these mystical experiences. Because they transcend the thinking mind, the rational mind. Sometimes it's called the transrational. They go into a deep space that is very paradoxical, where two seemingly different things can be true at the same time. And what's strange is that in those experiences, we can see the truth of both sides simultaneously. Even though, in our ordinary waking state of mind, they seem logically incompatible, right. Contradictory. They both can't be true, right? Our kind of binary thinking minds like to attach themselves to one idea or another. If they seem contradictory, we like to attach ourselves onto one or the other, right? It doesn't make sense to try to hold both of them if they're contradictory. And so this is, I think, where a lot of dogmatism is bred in a lot of religious traditions, where there might be ideas that seem contradictory between different religious traditions, and the dogma says, my way of thinking about it is the right way. It's the true right way, and these other folks, they're doing it wrong. They're interpreting it wrong. That they've got it, they've got it wrong. But in the mystical experience, it can be seen directly how they can both be true. They can both be right. That there is truth in both perspectives, and in many different perspectives, all at the same time. And that's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm totally with you there. And I think that is true. And I think that also there can be, as people, we're trying to interpret these experiences. And I think that we can sometimes put meaning to it that may not be, well, I guess any meaning to it is going to be somewhat incorrect, somewhat because it's beyond, the thinking mind. And so I think some people would push back, be like, well, some people had these experiences and then they said, this is the truth about it. And then we can see the fruit of that. And it was very destructive. And so what do you think causes people to interpret things that way? I guess I'm getting to the ego, basically.
Yeah. I think you're right that, any interpretation of mystical experience is ultimately not correct. It's not the experience itself. Sometimes I say that, the description of a tree is not the tree itself. It's that kind of difference. Yeah. And so we kind of have to hold on to these mystical experiences loosely in what we believe about them, because any kind of belief or interpretation of the experience, it can become something that we latch onto and become dogmatic about and say, this is the way things are, and that it can become an egoic pursuit. It can become another story in our thinking mind. It can be something that our ego attaches itself onto, and it almost becomes an identity, an ideology. And it's a funny thing, but the ego will even use spirituality and spiritual experiences and mystical experiences in order to try to aggrandize itself, protect itself, secure itself, trying to establish itself. We haven't really talked much about the ego. I mentioned it, before a little bit when talking about meditation and kind of transcending the thoughts of self, right? And that's really what I think ego is it's a story in our mind of who we think we are, right? It's often tied to a particular body. This body that we have here, we think we are this body. We are this person that is this age, this gender, this culture. We have these beliefs. We have these relationships. All of this feeds into the identity structure of the ego. And what can happen sometimes is when we have these mystical experiences, which is actually a shutting down of the ego is transcended in these experiences. That thought story, that identity is kind of dissolves for a period of time. But then as we come out of the experience, the ego will come back online. The thoughts return and begin interpreting the experience. And the ego can interpret the experience in not great ways sometimes.
Right.
Just because someone has a mystical experience doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to interpret or integrate that experience into their life in a healthy, positive way. And sometimes, depending on the constitution of the person and their life experiences, they might interpret the experience in very unwise or unskillful ways that can be harmful to their own life, to their family, to those around them, their environment, their society even. And so we have to be careful about what we do with these mystical experiences, how we interpret them. It is there's a whole, almost like a whole field of study regarding the interpretation of mystical experiences. What does it mean? Is it actually revelatory of truth? Can we believe these mystical experiences, what people say about them, right? And that is a really deep and complex conversation.
Right. Is that a phenomenology? Is that the...
Yeah, I think that is part of what goes into the interpretation of those types of experiences. Like
Right.
what was actually experienced versus what you think you
Mm-hmm.
experienced, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a bit of a disconnect there,
Mm-hmm.
between the actuality of the experience and how you describe it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's different schools and camps, that say, that you can't actually describe your experience.
Mm-hmm.
um, there's just different schools and
Right.
different ways of approaching the mystical experience and what it actually is. Some people think that there is no experience, and it's more of what the mind is doing, what the mind is trying to describe something, that seems to be beyond it,
Mm.
and the experience is more of what the mind is doing, in um, uh, interpreting itself, really.
Right. That's kind
Um,
of like a materialistic mindset versus, are we spirit and then having a physical experience, or is everything just physical and then that's all there is to it? And so
right.
our brain is just having these chemical reactions, and then we're saying it's beyond the brain,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. There's kind of a spiritual way of approaching these types of experiences, and a more kind of materialistic way of saying, well, yeah, it was just the brain gone haywire, and the neurons were, firing strangely, and it was all just, neurochemical reactions gone a little bit, there was a psychotic break or something,
Mm-hmm.
and it was pathological and meaningless. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
is
Right.
sometimes where a lot of kind of the materialist approach to these experiences goes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a spiritual side, which is kind of the side that I prefer, and embrace, which says, no, I think these mystical experiences are valuable. They are real. They are revelatory of deeper wisdom, and even the nature of reality, and kind of our deeper self, our deepest identity, can be discovered in these mystical experiences, and they're not meaningless. They can be extremely meaningful and life changing.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. I'm on your side. I'm a little biased there. I want to go back to what you were saying earlier, about kind of the revelatory understanding of who we are as God, and obviously a lot of people don't like that statement, and so I think it'd be helpful to kind of flesh that out. Like, are we all of God, or if we're God, why do we fall so short, so
Yeah.
often?
Yeah, that is one of the most interesting things about mystical experiences, is that they often reveal your deepest nature, your deepest identity, which many mystics say is identical to God. It is the divine. It is that highest power or deepest nature. And a lot of mystics are not shy about saying that. Um, and it's hard to describe. Um, of course, a lot of people think that it's a very egoic statement, right?
Right.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very inflated ego that thinks that they're God, right?
Right.
uh, um, but I think what the mystics are discovering is that the deepest nature of everyone, of each and every person, being, or thing, is God. It's not just them alone.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this inflated ego that says, oh, look at me, look at who I am. It is the deepest nature of all things and all beings and all humans is God. And that, I think, is a very different way of looking at it. And of course, that also sounds quite radical to many people, especially theists that see God as this great other, the supreme being out there somewhere, the creator, right?
Right.
That's a really radical idea, to think that God is actually not some great other separate from us, but rather is our own deepest nature. When we get down to the very fundamental being that we are, and everything is, it is all God. It all arises from that deepest source, that ultimate reality. And obviously, we all have these bodies that seem to be separate from each other. And one way that I like to think about that is that all of these forms that we have, these bodies, these things, these objects, they're all manifestations of God. They're all incarnations of that deepest being, that deepest source, that ultimate reality. They're all coming into being as kind of the waves are formations of the ocean. I really like that analogy of the ocean and its waves, because I think it helps to describe, our individual bodies are like individual waves of the ocean. Obviously, the ocean is very large, and you could consider it kind of an infinite plane, right? But it forms itself into particular embodiments, particular forms or shapes. And in a similar way, I think God is becoming each and every one of us and everything in existence in the entire universe. It's all the embodiment of God.
Yeah.
And that's a radical thing to think about.
Yeah. I think it's quite beautiful. But obviously, the next question is, well, if we're all God, what happens? Sometimes we don't act like it.
It's true. I think what happens is that we fall into, and I put fall with a capital F, because I think that is what is symbolized in the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden. We fall into these ego identities, these stories, the thoughts of the mind begin to attach themselves onto particular things, and begin to define themselves by those things, those stories, those thoughts in the mind, the attachment to our particular body. And when that happens, when we fall in, when we this self-identity develops, it can go off the rails in different ways. That identity wants to protect itself from death, from disillusion, from harm. It wants to secure itself. It wants to build up itself into something bigger. And when it does that, it can act in ways that are not in harmony with our deepest nature of the divine, of being God. And that is also what I call the veil. The ego is that veil that kind of obscures or hides our deepest divine nature, and causes us to do all manner of things that are not helpful or even harmful to ourselves and other people around us.
Yeah, I agree. I think psychology does a good job of kind of explaining that and describing that, and I think it's helpful to like Jung is called parts work, to discern the different parts of us and what they want and what they're saying, and be like, well, sometimes I act within my true nature as God, and then sometimes I really don't, and so the more you can be in the moment and recognize these things, then you can stop them or talk back or be like, hey, you know what? Even not that like the ego is necessarily like evil. It's like it's trying to protect us, but it's doing it in a unhealthy way. So we can be like, I thank you for trying to help me, but this is not helpful. Let's think about how to act in a better way, or think or feel in better ways.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of contemplative practices like meditation, sometimes called mindfulness. You become very aware of your own ego and your own inclinations and proclivities and faults. You begin to witness them as thoughts and ideas and desires as they come up in your mind. You become very aware of your own self, your and all different qualities of yourself, both kind of the ego self and then also that deeper God self. You see both of them. You become very aware and are able to discern when your ego is acting in different ways, because you spent a lot of time kind of training your awareness and consciousness to become aware of those thoughts and ideas that are defining yourself in the world, and you begin to be able to better control the way that you're behaving when you're aware of how you are behaving, right? A lot of people just behave the way that they feel without a lot of awareness, without self-awareness, without a lot of mindfulness, and that is some spiritual teachers call it, unconsciousness. The way that we can behave when we're not deeply aware and mindful of our own inclinations, our own thoughts, our own behaviors. And so that's one of the I think benefits of a contemplative practice like meditation. You become very aware of your ego, and then when you can let that go, when you can let it subside, then the deeper wisdom arises.
Yeah, totally. That's great stuff. So, now that you've had these experiences and these realizations, what do you identify with religion, or what do you call yourself now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I were going to try to put a label on me, I would say I'm kind of a universalist mystic, where I can kind of see the truth in all the different religious and spiritual traditions, but I don't attach myself necessarily to any particular one. I might have preferences of one or another tradition or ideas from different traditions, but I don't identify myself with any particular one of them. Obviously, I have a background in Mormonism and Christianity, and so I like to frame a lot of my thoughts about mysticism using the symbols and the concepts of Christianity, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I also recognize that they're not necessarily the only way of interpreting or conceptualizing these spiritual ideas, and so I use ideas from lots of different cultures and traditions to try to help point to those deepest insights that we can have. So yeah, universalist mystic might be one way that I would kind of describe where I'm at right now.
Okay. Yeah. So that's great, but it's also hard because most people, they identify themselves with a group, with a particular tradition, and that's how they form community. And so, have you been able to find some community since that point?
Yeah, there are actually several communities out there that are more universalist in nature, where they are much more open to seeing many different perspectives kind of at once, or thinking about many different ways. One is the Unitarian Universalists, which is perhaps one of the biggest ones. There are others, and so we have occasionally congregated with that community, and they're wonderful. They're very open and loving, and very willing to consider many different perspectives and ideas and different ways of life, different ways of considering God. Even atheists can be, members of
Mm-hmm.
a Unitarian Universalist congregation. They're also accepted and included, because that is a legitimate way of living life, and so that is also included. And so, Unitarian Universalism is not the only one. There are some other ones that I've heard of out there, but it's one of the ones that we have found some community with. They're not really huge in many areas. They're usually more smaller congregations here and there, but you can find them, and the ones that we have congregated with, they've always been really great people.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I was just thinking, some people, when you say these communities can consider many different perspectives, they would still be like, well, what is the bedrock of truth of what guides y'all? And I guess for me, my answer would be, hopefully it would be that trying to spur on these experiences with God, and I would say love God, that relationship, it's that relationship is love, and having that with yourself, and then the outflow of that onto others, and seeing everyone as one, as parts of God, as parts of ourselves. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree that ultimately we're trying to get to that deepest insight of oneness, which I think is also called love, because that then leads to a very fulfilling life, in relationship to all other beings, animals and humans, and nature, and what we're doing here on Earth. I think ultimately, if we want to know kind of the truth, if we want to know who we really are, I think it's those mystical experiences that can reveal that to us. And once we know that, once we have seen that oneness, that love, then it almost becomes an outflow of our own nature. Our own behavior in the world becomes a manifestation of that oneness, of that love. And so we naturally become very loving, friendly, peaceful people. When we've seen our deepest nature as God, as the one, as love, then we begin to manifest that in our life. And I think we can see this in many people from many different traditions who seem to have had these very deep experiences. They almost universally tend to be very calm, peaceful, loving, happy people. And I think those are, in Christianity, we might say that those are the fruits of the Spirit, right? It becomes the natural way of living life once we know our deepest self. It's that saying that know yourself, know thyself is the deepest wisdom, and I think that is true.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that some people might never have a profound, deep, awakening spiritual experience, and I think that's okay. And I think every moment we can have a little piece of that, and many people just go through life and they already have this kind of realization. They don't need a big experience, and they can live this out. And so it doesn't have to be like an exclusive, like, have you had this experience or have you not? And if you haven't, you're not
Right.
enlightened or something like that.
Yeah.
In a way, almost, for me, I'm like, I was so unhealthy that I needed a huge experience to like get me there.
Yeah. For some of us, we really need that kind of experience to kind of knock us out of our habitual ways and really wake us up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it's sometimes, termed is waking up. It's
Mm-hmm.
awakening. It's coming back to life. It's a resurrection. It's
Right.
it's changing. It's changing our life. It's changing our identity. And for some people, they really need that. They need that radical shift in their life. Sometimes you might even call it, a midlife crisis type of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But other people, they really don't. They're happy, doing what they're doing and living life, without these kinds of deep mystical experiences. As long as they're living life in a loving, compassionate way, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that. They're already,
Mm-hmm.
living out their deepest nature.
Right.
Perhaps, unknowingly, but that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to, obviously it's been a huge journey for you, and very life-changing and perspective shifting. And I've gone through kind of the same experience, but I can't imagine, what is that like, having a family, having, being married and having kids? How did they interact with you on this journey? And did they take the same journey, or did they push back against that? What were those dynamics like?
Yeah, well, it's been very different. Considering like my siblings and parents and kind of extended family, they're all very much still Mormon in the LDS Church, and so they. I haven't had many discussions with them about mysticism because I think they believe very differently than I do. But fortunately, me and my wife, we both left the church kind of together, and we were both kind of on that soul searching path together. I don't think my wife has had the kind of experiences that I have had, but she's very open and accepting and loving of my path and my journey and where I've been and how I see things now. And I'm very fortunate that she is that way, because I know, in many relationships, faith issues can become, a point of struggle and contention in a relationship. But we've been very open with allowing each other kind of to go on our own journeys, our faith journeys, and kind of end up where we currently are. As far as my children go, they know that I've had these kinds of experiences, and I've written a lot about mysticism. I don't think they're quite interested in it yet. I've attempted a few times to talk with them about it, and they're just like, it just goes way over my head, Dad.
Right.
But maybe one day they'll sit down and read some of the things I've written, or ask me questions, and I'm more than willing to talk about these things with them. I think early on in life, we're not really concerned about a lot of these deeper questions.
Right.
They only seem to kind of become a thing later on, in our 20s and 30s. We start really questioning, what am I doing, in my life?
Right.
And then the questions about God and our true self and stuff like that, they begin to come up, and we begin to ask the questions. And so me and my wife, we really just try to teach our kids how to love, very simply, just in all our interactions with each other and with other people. We try to teach love as much as we possibly can. And we think that's a good kind of foundation for them to at least start out their life on that kind of a path.
Yeah, that's so powerful and great that your wife can give you that space and appreciation for your journey, even if hers, her experiences have not been quite the same. And I think likewise, it's really great that you have that grace and understanding about your children, and just it is the natural development of a human, and like you said, these questions usually come up later in life.
The ego, that kind of self-identity, it develops. It takes time and many years throughout, childhood and adolescence and your teenager years. It doesn't become kind of fully developed, I think, until perhaps your late teens or early 20s is really when kind of the ego has really started to solidify into this thing, this identity. And then that's when it can start going off the rails, and we start to question it, right?
I think Ram Dass said you have to become somebody before you can forget who you like you lose that identity that maybe is not serving you anymore, that you are more than that, but you do have to. It's important for children to develop an identity. So
Richard Rohr says the same type of thing. He says, you've got to have a container for your life first before you can empty it.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I think, we've talked a lot about the different, if anyone is interested in learning more about kind of these perspectives, you're welcome to my website, thymindoman.com, where I've written a lot about these different things from different perspectives, different traditions, different religions. There's also many accounts of mystical experiences on there that you can read about. And of course, you can reach out to me if you'd like to talk with me more, either through email or one-on-one video chat. I'm open and willing to have some chats.
Yeah, that's great. I'll make sure I link that in the show description. Awesome. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate your wisdom, your friendship, and just helping me articulate these things and flesh them out. You're really great at that. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me here, Kendall.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back on. I know that you're really into AI stuff, and we could talk about that as well as anything else. So
that would be fun. Yeah. We should do it.
Awesome. All right. I'll see y'all guys later.